Hello and welcome to That Atheist Show. I'm Preston, that atheist dude.
I'm Connie, that atheist lady. This week we have William Poire. He is the regional director for the Oklahoma chapter of American Atheists. And he has done some awesome things to help ensure that the separation of church and state continues to stay a thing. I came to know him through Leia, the woman that I helped down in Duncan that was going through the issues after her son had the bullying after they reported the Bible distribution. So, William, thank you for being with us. And
Thank
how
you
are
for
you doing
having me.
tonight?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Pretty good.
Good.
And so, we're going to talk about the Ten Commandments mostly, just because that's been a big, huge, crazy ordeal all over the country lately for some odd reason. So you wrote a big old huge long thing that I still have not gotten a chance to read all of, but what I did read
That's a
was
shame.
amazing.
It is a
So
lot.
if I've really tried, man, but it has all kinds of good information in there. And so if you would like to summarize the most important reasons why the Ten Commandments should not be on government property, I think that would be a good place to start.
Sure. Well, this was basically going to be an amicus brief. As I was pointing out to you earlier before the show began, I was a plaintiff in a federal lawsuit that didn't seem to gain as much media attention as the state lawsuit, although, of course, it was a national story. There was another thing that seemed to have happened right about that same time. It involved gay rights, and so whenever it was first announced, so it kind of got swept under the rug. But it's the gay agenda that are usurping the notoriety of atheists.
Damn
So
it.
I guess as long as atheists are not the most hated, but right now they're getting a lot of love. As long as we can stay right above the Tea Party members, I think we're good.
Yeah, I think we're.
But no, there was a federal lawsuit against the Oklahoma Commission who authorized this, and it was a federal lawsuit. So of course we had the ACLU lawsuit, which was taking upon the Oklahoma Constitution, showing that it was unconstitutional per Article 2, Section 5. Or I'm sorry, Section 5, Article 2. And they were the ones arguing that it was unconstitutional per that. And the American Atheists spearheaded this legal challenge per the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause of the Constitution. And of course, again, with the ruling of the state, it kind of became defunct, so it's no longer needed. But I was a plaintiff in it, and upon my release of legal standing per the judge, I said, sorry, but being offended, as if it was really regarding offense, had nothing to do with offense, had to do with my position on it. But after that, I decided to write an amicus brief, and this basically became what you read, of which I'm producing a video because I understand that many Americans, as you can tell based upon biblical literacy, do not like to read.
Yeah.
So audiobooks seems to be the way to go. Perhaps it'll become a book someday. But yeah, it's the arguments that I formulated. There's the whole host of arguments one could give against it. However, because they're the spirit of the Decalogue, the 10 being this grand thing, I figured I would just call it 10 reasons against the Ten Commandments monument. But what I always do is I like to preface this because when people see American atheists challenging this, there's this idea that atheists are attacking Christians. Mm-hmm. We see this all the time, that it's liberal against conservative.
Right.
It's this us versus them mentality, the social identity. And all they see beside me, they don't see me as an American. They don't see me as an Oklahoma, but they see me as an atheist. Mm-hmm. And I always like to point out this is not about atheists against Christians, but this is very much about we the people against the government. And for those conservatives who wish to argue that I'm not some patriot because here I am, oh my gosh, you're going against the Ten Commandments. For one, they're misunderstanding the point that we are not a nation inspired by the Ten Commandments. Mm-hmm. But I'm simply acting upon my patriotic duty to petition the government for redress of grievances. And so whenever I'm coming to the government, what I'm saying is that you have acted outside of your constitutional bounds. We are a constitutional republic with a representative democracy, which is to say that those who are allowed and who are citizens, who are eligible to vote, vote in people who therefore pass laws on their behalf, but those lawmakers are beholden to an existing constitution. And it is my point of contention that per these constitutions which have been implemented, the Ten Commandments monument is unconstitutional.
Absolutely.
Definitely. And so a lot of people argue that this is a Christian nation, which I still don't understand where they even get that from.
Was it the Cold
But-
War? Wasn't it just the Cold War? Like they did the godless commies and they just scared the shit out of everybody until everyone thought that, America was under God, and they wrote it in the dollar bill and they wrote it in the pledge. Is that the main source, or is there another reason for that? Like,
Well, it's been included, the aforementioned phrase, in God we trust, has been included on the coins dating back to the middle 19th century, I believe, 18 something or another. But yeah, I do think that you see these rallying cries all throughout our history, and they all come to God. They always point to God is on our side, and if you can look no further, your lights went out. What's going on?
oh, that's just her camera doing weird
Connie.
things.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, it happens.
She
Sorry.
needs to get cameras.
You can look no further than the Old Testament to see this very tactic. So I don't think it's necessarily so much like, it's not an admission
That's true. It
that
is.
we are a nation under God. You go back to Moses, you go
Yeah.
back to Joseph, all these people, and it's always God is on our side. God is going to help us win this war. And so what we see, at the founding, everybody was fearful of everybody else, which is why we have the Establishment Clause, because it wasn't so much that they were fearful of Muslims. They weren't. They barely made up, if any, sort of citizens of the United States, but they were fearful of each other.
Right.
And so, of course, they started out very secular, although they prayed. And a lot of Christians, they love to point this out. They say, well, they prayed, at the first meeting of the council. Who gives a crap? They also beat and the crap out of their slaves, which is what the Bible says they could do. So we are no more beholden to the Founding Fathers' views of religion than we are their views of slavery. What we should talk about is what's right. And what was wrong in the 50s was, of course, uniting people on this idea that we have this singular God. But even then, I really don't even think it's till the 80s until this takes off, or about the 70s when the Roe versus Wade takes place. And it's that point, the Roe versus Wade, the very controversial ruling, which is basically saying, hey, women have rights, men shouldn't dictate it. It's at this point that all of a sudden these thousands of denominations of Christianity finally came together and coalesced under this umbrella and said, we are Christians. Because if you ask somebody back in the 50s, if JFK, was a Christian, they would tell you, hell no. And so I would say, yeah, the 50s was where it kind of really began, but the 70s and 80s was when it took off, especially in the rain.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate for
Which
us. Because now it's just grown
and
into this huge movement of
Do you
persecution.
think that it's gotten even worse since 9/11? Like, I feel like people kind of just didn't really care a whole lot, and it wasn't such a big deal, because my dad is an atheist and my grandpa is an atheist, and it was just never really a thing. It just wasn't much of a thing. They never had the problems that I've had or my kids have had because we're atheists. So,
Being an atheist?
yeah. So it seems like people just didn't really care, but then it seemed like there was something socially within the American society after 9/11 that made people want to make sure people know that they're Christian, and that they're, because if you're not Christian, then you're probably Muslim, or what I
Right.
mean? So it became
I remember
this.
believing that because I was 11 when that happened. I was here in New York when the towers came down, and I remember just thinking the worst things about Muslims, just like, their religion is Satan, my religion is God, my religion is going to save me from this terrorism for the rest of my life and all this stuff. And it's like, if I don't believe,
Yeah.
I'm going to end up like them. That's really what was
Yeah.
drilled into my brain.
Because I went to church at the time, and there was a lot of that. And I went to a non-denominational church, and so it was very. Then all of a sudden, see you at the poll started being
Yeah.
a thing again.
Started having to pray
you know,
everywhere.
yeah, go and make sure everybody knows that you're a Christian, and because you have to be a Christian patriot, and if you're not Christian, then you're not patriotic, and so it seems like some.
Bush had to do with that also, though. Bush
Well,
was
yeah,
always
because
calling
Bush
upon God.
would call us, well, and he straight up called us a Christian nation too, in some of his speeches. So
That's true.
Yeah, my thoughts on the whole Christian nation thing, and yeah, I do think that the aftermath of 9/11, it brought people together, which was good. Unfortunately, it turned people away too, because the Sikhs and Muslims of this country all of a sudden became the targets of ridicule, discrimination. But it did bring the majority of Americans together, and the majority of Americans just happen to be Christian.
Yep.
Does that make us a Christian nation? And in order to revert back and answer the question, of course not. If we were a Christian nation, we would be feeding the poor. We lose, I think, $73 billion annually from tax exempt statuses to religious churches and property, and yet the world could end all hunger for 30 million a year. So for twice as much as what we lose in tax exemptions for churches, we could feed the world 2 times over, and yet we don't. Are we a Christian nation? Hell no. We're a nation whose people go out and Tebow in public and pray, despite Matthew 6:5-6 saying, "Can you hear my kids in the background?"
yeah,
Gosh.
it's okay.
Despite saying, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray in the synagogues. Pray in secret. And the word that is used there is kryptos, which 11 times throughout the New Testament either means hidden or inward. It means to pray in private. You see all these teachings of Jesus. Yeah, it's about, hey, do it privately. And in fact, you can go and read throughout the New Testament, with the exception of one time when Jesus, there was 2, it depends upon if you're reading Luke or Matthew, but basically, in effect, there was 2 children who were brought to Jesus, and he was asked to pray for them. And the only way you can do that is put your hand on them and pray, which necessarily precludes praying in private. But every time, it's either he went a stone's throw away, he went to the top of a mountain, or he stepped away, or once when Jesus was praying in private. All these different phrases show that Jesus prayed.
I've never thought of that. That is such a good point. He always steps away to pray.
Always steps away. Every time, with the exception of one.
Wow.
Now, he blessed food and gave thanks to God in public, of course.
Yep.
But this is totally different from praying.
Right, exactly.
So,
absolutely.
I mean, there's so many different means by which we could demonstrate that we are not a Christian nation. The biggest one being that we, of course, are everything antithetical to Jesus. Now, of course, that's a very theological statement, because first of all, we're presupposing that a historical Jesus existed.
Right.
But I'm talking about the character, Jesus of Nazareth. And if you go back to the earliest Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and you take the traditions from the Q source, and we're getting into our criticism here, but I don't really regard John as being too historical. But if we were to get to those, I think you can get a basic idea, at least of what the traditions were saying about Jesus, whether he was historical or not, whether he was myth. We get an idea, at the very least, of what the traditions are. And what he was at least teaching is everything antithetical to that which is America. So no, we're not a Christian nation.
Definitely.
No more than we're a white nation, just because the majority of people make it so. So
right.
We're a white nation. Are we a white people? No, I mean we're Americans, and that's kind of the point. If we can go back to the 10 Commandments, is that this isn't about atheists and Christians fighting. This is about we the people of all walks of life, of all faiths, of all genders, of all races, of all age, coming together and saying, look, government, you have overstepped your bounds.
Yep.
And ironically, the people who are supporting the 10 Commandments monument on the Capitol are those who claim to be the most devout Christians, conservatives. And this to me is odd, because if you look at what Jesus says in the Gospel of John, again, I reject most of the Gospel of John for a number of reasons, but he states explicitly, my kingdom is not of this world. That is as a side note, that's kind of John speaks in vertical dualism, whereas a horizontal dualism is applied to the synoptics. This age and the age to come. And John, he speaks of the above and the below. In fact, John 3:3, when he's talking to Nicodemus, a lot of Christians get this idea, you must be a born-again Christian. That's a mistranslation. It's a double entendre, which works only in the Greek. There's the word pneuma, which means wind or can mean spirit. But in John 3:3, he says, you must be born from above, from the above. And that's what he's talking about. And by the way, what that means is that because it works only in the Greek, that the Aramaic in which Jesus spoke, he most likely did not speak those words. Mm-hmm. We can go on about the difference between John and the Synoptics, but of importance is recognizing that to the Christian who supports this, Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. And Paul says that we are to be ambassadors of Christ. And an ambassador is a representative, a foreign diplomat who comes into a foreign country and represents the country from where they come. So Christians are to be like foreign diplomats representing Jesus' kingdom. They are not to be unnecessarily entangled in these worldly matters. They're supposed to be simply representatives who respect the laws of the land. Romans 13:1, you obey the governing authorities. Sure, you can protest these things, and sure, you can speak up and say, hey, this is not a Christian thing to do. But the very definition of secular, what it means is either an absence of religion or simply worldly. And these are worldly laws. These are worldly constitutions. And Christians are to recognize that they're supposed to be looking towards his kingdom, no matter that we may disagree. But the fact that they are supporting this monument, while it goes against two of our constitutions and has been ruled by our governing authorities as being unconstitutional, the fact that they are protesting it and still supporting it, they are going against what the Bible teaches.
Yeah. I wonder how many of them have actually read the whole Bible, though.
I doubt many of them have.
Also, those who have are probably no longer Christians. I'm one of them.
Yeah, and whenever I saw a lot of the pictures going around of people gathering at it because it's going to be taken down, and they're like touching it and crying around it, and I'm like, all it reminds me of, yeah, exactly, Preston, that's what that reminds me of, is them worshiping an idol. They're like basically worshiping the statue. And exactly. Yeah, and it's just like, it's creepy for one, and then ridiculous. For two, it goes against what they claim to believe.
Well, that's great segue. I mean, let's talk about that. The thou shalt have no other gods before me, and then of course you shall make no gods, no worship, no idols. And of course, what they're trying to do is they're trying to distance themselves from the Canaanites, despite the fact that the majority and consensus of scholars will acknowledge that the God of Israel, Yahweh, evolved from a Canaanite pantheon. And they're trying to distance themselves from the Canaanites, and we see that disassociation. So while they shared many of the same beliefs and many of the same practices, they begin to sort of justify it and kind of rationalize why they do what they do. Why do they make sacrifices? And when you see throughout the archaeology, you basically with an understanding of source theory and how the Bible, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible came about, here they're trying to justify why they sacrifice. Well, it's to appease God. God loves sacrifices. Yep. Whereas the Canaanites, it was mostly, it's the same thing, to appease God. But of course, they had their various reasons. But so you see this commandment saying that you shall make no idols, but what do you see in the ritual Decalogue? We're talking about the ethical Decalogue, Exodus 20. That is set at the site of the capital. But what do we see in Exodus 34? Do you know?
No.
Not off the top.
Okay, go ahead and look it up.
She's got all kinds of Bibles.
I got all kinds of Bibles. I've read them all, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
I used to read the New International Version. I think a little bit of KJV.
Exodus what?
34? Exodus 34, 17, I believe. 34, and for the viewers out there, there's not just one set of 10 commandments. There are 3.
In the same books, right? You
shall make for yourself no molten gods.
Right. How does that contradict? And by the way, go ahead and read 34:26. This is the best one.
Which Bible is that, Connie?
Hold on, I'll look in a second. The first fruits of your ground you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
There you
remember
go.
seeing
That's
that
the
pop
Ten
up on my
Commandments right
newsfeed. I
So
love
yeah,
that one.
the
It's
set
a
at the
revised standard edition, Preston.
Okay.
the set at the Capitol is the wrong set according to the Bible. And that's one thing that many Christians don't recognize. You have the Exodus 20, and this is the fifth ascent to Mount Sinai. Now, if you look at the Deuteronomy sources, or if you look at, like, for example, Exodus 3, the mountain is called Horeb. Why is it called Horeb in some places, or the mountain of God in Sinai and others? That's a talk for the source theory, because we could talk about the Yahwist and Elohist source from the northern and southern kingdoms. But the source in Exodus 34, which is a Yahweh source, which came from the southern tribe, the southern kingdom of Israel, right before they were exiled into Babylon. It specifically mentions 17, Exodus 34:17, about molten gods. And the reason for this was because, of course, the kingdoms became separated back in the day. They all had their traditions of Moses. They had their traditions of the patriarchs. And when they became separated, you had two separate kingdoms, the kingdom from the north and the kingdom from the south. And it's King Jeroboam, who is ruling from the southern, and King Rehoboam from the north. And he begins to fear that because you have Solomon's temple in the southern kingdom, that the people would go down to the southern kingdom with their first fruits and with their livestock, and they would make sacrifices at the temple. And he feared that when they did this, they would eventually pledge their allegiance to the southern king. And so he would eventually just be killed off, and there would be no need for him. So what does he do? He establishes his own version of these stories, which is why we have two creation accounts, two flood narratives, the selling of Joseph into slavery, but especially why we have, especially in Exodus, two different accounts of the Ten Commandments, which vary, Exodus 20 and Exodus 34. We can talk about Deuteronomy 5 later, because it varies only in the commandment about honoring the Sabbath. But in Exodus 34, it was almost a polemic against the northern tribe. Yahweh, the Yahweh source written in the southern kingdom, is basically accounting, and they're specifically saying make no molten idols. And the reason why was because in Solomon's temple, if you look at how God, supposedly Yahweh, is telling Moses how you should make the tabernacle, and the tabernacle was a very Canaanite concept. It was a tent where Yahweh, the God, would dwell. And he says to Moses, supposedly, that they're to go down there and in Solomon's temple make this ark, and then inside the ark you would place the Ten Commandments, and you would basically place over the ark, it would be gold, and you have two cherubim. And that's not like when we think of cherubim, we think of like the little,
Little angels.
kids, the little angels shooting arrows, pew, 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 making people fall in love. No, they were like two sphinxes with wings, and they were massive. And so the king of the north, he realizes that they're going to continue going down there, making the sacrifices, so he implements his own festivals. He implements his own, basically, his own concept of the Yahweh religion. Yeah, and rather than having two olive wood gold-plated cherubim, he has a golden calf, a golden bull. Why is it a bull? Well, because, of course, El, from which Yahweh evolved, was known as Bull El. He was a bull god of the Canaanites. And so right there you can see that we have these two different Ten Commandments, but it's worth noting that the only set ever called the Ten Commandments in the Bible is that which is found in Exodus 34, the set that is not at the capital. Despite Yahweh's declaration, of course, that he would write upon the first, which, he would write upon the second, which were on the first. But it all goes down. If you read this and you realize what's happening here, we have two different accounts, either on Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. It doesn't make sense unless you begin to read it from a scholarly point of view and realize that these two accounts came independently and they were interwoven together, not selectively, but maximally. They had, when they were exiled into Babylon, and the Persians, they come out, and this is all mentioned in Exodus or Ezra 26, and basically the Persians come over and Cyrus the Great, and they overthrow the Babylonians, and they say, all right, you Israelites, you go back to Judah and you establish your own laws. You are religiously autonomous. You are legally autonomous. And so here are these exiled Jews, and they have these scripts and these texts which they believe to be authoritative, and they believe them to be absolutely true. And so the Persians charged them with the task of writing their own laws and coming up with their laws based upon their writings. And all they had these numbers, and they had what would become Exodus, and they had what would become of Genesis. They had all these different manuscripts. And some redactor, or at least two redactors, came together and interwove them into some just ridiculously difficult to read, complex, grueling 5 books of the Bible that we get. And so the point that needs to be addressed, of course, is that not only are they set at the Capitol not the correct set, but that even Exodus 20, the one that is there, it says right in the preamble, "I'm the Lord your God, Yahweh, who delivered you from the land of Egypt." That is important because these laws, these edicts, are not intended for us. They were intended for the Israelites. And we are not to be bound by Israelite law any more than the law of Rome or Greece or any of these ancient Near East religions. In fact, the Ten Commandments were preceded by the Code of Ur-Nama by hundreds of years in the Code of Hammurabi. So if it is a fact that the Code of Hammurabi influenced the Ten Commandments, as many would like to argue, because they share similarities, that both suzerain covenants, they both contain the same kind of concepts, why don't we put a Code of Hammurabi up there?
Yeah.
Because we're not bound to it. We're not bound to the Ten Commandments. They don't influence American law in any meaningful way.
Absolutely.
Also, something that I just thought about because I pulled out that Bible and I saw my cowboy Bible here.
Yeehaw!
The cowboy church is kind of a newer development, but is kind of a big thing in Oklahoma. I'm sure you've interacted with some cowboy church weirdos, or have you not? There's a lot of cowboy church going on here in Shawnee, Oklahoma, okay? And they are screaming real loud about the Ten Commandments monument and whatnot. But I'm holding their Bible right here.
What does
Ten
it
Commandments
say?
aren't in it.
At all?
No, it's just the New Testament. The cowboy Bible is only the New Testament. Ten Commandments aren't anywhere in it.
Does it follow exactly like what any of the other versions say, or is it like its own
I mean,
thing?
it's not in there at all. Well, I mean, it's only the New Testament. They don't have anything from any of the Old Testament.
Well, in that case, then you have only Jesus' words, and he only lists 5 of them, and then he adds the 6.
Yeah. So
even that, and those are mostly the secular ones that we see so universal throughout society. Non-Jews, we see people all around the world that seem to have arrived at these same conclusions. Again, the Code of Ur-Nama, or Code of Unami, and the Code of Hammurabi had prohibitions against murder, against bearing a false witness, against theft.
Yeah.
I mean, against adultery. These are all concepts. These are not something that need to be handed down from above. They're not divine.
Right, exactly. They're made by humans. It's a social evolution that happened, that basically we learned how to create our own morals after a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
It started
and adultery,
with those basic things.
not wanting adultery to happen is a thing that came about whenever people figured out what paternity was. And then it was a matter of wanting to know that your kids were your kids.
Yeah, who's who.
Right.
So.
It was a patriarchal society.
Mm-hmm.
Women were property. They were sold into marriage for a few head of cattle.
Yeah.
And it was a means of saying that, I want to ensure that my kids are my kids and they're from my offspring. So, you know what? We're going to outlaw it.
And it wasn't a big deal for the man to have sex with multiple women. That was actually encouraged.
Right. That's something that, you see even Solomon, who's considered to be the wisest, he had 700 wives and concubines. And I was at
something women weren't allowed to do. Women weren't allowed to sleep with other people, and that was all because the man wanted to be sure that the kids were his kids.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole context of that has totally changed from the biblical context of what it was talking about, because now there wouldn't have been all the hoopla over the Ashley Madison stuff if we still thought of it the way that it was thought about when it was written.
Yeah, people are still stuck in these traditional views, pretty much.
And that's, I think Preston hit it. I think whenever he was talking about how they evolve and how we come about, and we've realized that some of these things were wrong. I mean, just look at the fact that the Old Testament and even the New Testament condone and endorse and in fact regulate slavery.
Yep.
And I would go as far as to say that really the only way in which we are a country founded upon biblical principles is one points out that, hey, we were founded upon slavery and the subordination of women. But at some point, we figured out that was wrong. At some point, we figured out it was wrong. And so here you have this Bible telling you that it's A-okay, 2 thumbs up. And then we figured it out. How did we figure that out? If it wasn't from religion, it had to have been by secular means. And so we have evolved to recognize, regardless of the religious nature of these claims, we've evolved our morality to say these things are wrong. Proof of that, Connie, is in your New Testament that you're holding. Not only just the New Testament, but the Cowboy New Testament, which has conveniently forgot to include the Old Testament. So the fact that there's even a New Testament wherein Jesus is supposedly, I mean, sure, he
religion
really
itself
emphasizes the New Testament law. Right. But what does he do? He's basically just saying, hey, there's a spirit of the law. You guys are misunderstanding it. No, yeah. I mean, the Pharisees condemn him. They're saying, oh, you don't wash your hands before you eat. And he turns around on them and says, but you don't stone your unruly children to death, do you? You could take that one of two ways. You can take that as saying, well, here Jesus is clearly saying that you must obey every jot and tittle of the law, which he did say, no jot or tittle of the law shall in no wise perish until all is fulfilled. Christians interpret that as meaning when he died on the cross it's fulfilled. In reality, he's talking about the eschaton, the end of the age, at which time the messianic age, the kingdom of God, or kingdom of heaven as it's known in Matthew, would come about.
The apocalypse.
And what he means is that, right, at which point the Satan and God are going to war and this and that. The end of the world. Jesus was very much an apocalyptic prophet. He believed that the world was going to end. But Jesus, at the same time, he's saying, look, guys, there's a spirit of the law in which it was written. It was handed down to Moses. There's a reason why. And that's where he includes it in his version of the Ten Commandments when he says, love God and love your neighbors as you love yourself. And so even it seems to be somehow the traditions that we get from the Q source seem to suggest that Jesus didn't really regard the first 4 as being too, great. So he talks about some of these secular things. But of importance, it's even Jesus is acknowledging that it's changing.
Yep.
So you get these hundreds of years. Right. And that's what the New Testament is. And yet here we are, 2,000 years removed from that time, and we're still doing it. And the fact that we can demonstrate this, because anytime you have someone point out slavery, that it's a different time, this and that. Well, I'm sorry, but you're just acknowledging that you have secular morality. When you do that, when you cherry pick from the Bible the good stuff, you are acknowledging that you have secular morals.
What I tell people, I always post this every few weeks. I'm like, to all of you cherry-picking Christians, thank the secular activists that have gone out there and changed these laws, because without these laws being changed by us, you would still be beheaded for not following the government law. The government interpretation of the Bible was something that you had to follow, and if you didn't follow that, you would die. And if not for the secular activists changing that and saying, hey, no, let's, in America especially, saying, no, let's bring all beliefs here and let all beliefs be personal, that allowed all of the cherry pickers to come and say, hey, we don't agree with this part of the Bible, so we'll believe in this part of the Bible. And it's like, well, you're being allowed to do that by secular people.
On that point, great segue. Let's talk about the Ten Commandments, because these people are saying that they influenced American laws, right?
Right.
And yet we can go through the first commandment, which is saying that you will have basically the freedom to worship. You can, government will not infringe upon your rights to exercise religion as you see fit. And yet, what does the first commandment tell us? You shall have no other gods. And this is the first commandment of the ethical decalogue, of course. You shall have no other gods before me. What was the punishment for that? Stoning, death. I think it's Exodus 22:20. Deuteronomy 17, 2 through 5, and 13. If you worship another god, you're to be stoned. Right. But if you look at it, there's really only 3 or 4 laws or commandments that would be in any way approximate American laws. And again, those same 4, those secular laws, are laws that are universally pervasive throughout society, non-Jew, Gentile, whatever, alike. They precede the Bible. They precede at least the giving of the Ten Commandments to Moses, either on Mount Horeb or Sinai, depending on the Bible verse. But those that we see, the first 6, they're not included in our laws. No way. We're allowed to worship whomever or whatever. We're allowed to speak. We're allowed to say "God damn it," which is, by the way, not blasphemy. It's not taking the Lord's name in vain, because God is a title.
Yep.
And yet it will still be censored if you say "God damn it." Honor your mother and father. No laws against that. But yet, if you break the first commandment, you're just stoned to death. The third commandment is just simply to be executed. But the fourth, fifth, and seventh commandments are stoning to death. And yet we see in our eighth amendment that you shall have a protection from cruel and unusual punishment. So at what point do we just draw back and point out, like, look, these commandments, these mere dictates are not in any way influential in American law? And you can go back to the founding fathers. But even if they were, we somehow found a way to overcome them. And the fact that we have protection from the punishments breaking these is evidence of the fact that these are archaic. And we should be glad that we've moved on from these, these proclamations handed down to people that try to figure out where rain went at night. Yeah. The sun goes down at night. Where the hell does the sun go? Where does the rain come from?
Is it going to come
these
back?
These are the people that gave us these laws. Yeah, these are the people that gave us these laws.
It's nighttime.
So again,
What's next?
to drive the point home, the ethical decalogue in Exodus 20, the preamble of it states that Yahweh was given this to the Israelites whom he delivered from the bondage of Egypt. These are foreign laws. Again, Jesus' kingdom is supposed to be a foreign place. You want to believe that? Fine, you believe that. But we are governed by worldly, secular laws.
And the thing about Israel is America has this crazy strong relationship with Israel. And it's not even all of America, it's just mainly the Republican Party. They are in love with Israel, and they want to protect everything, and they expect Israel to bring about the end times. They expect the revelations to come through Israel, and they're waiting and they're wanting all of it to happen so they can go to their kingdom. And this is very bad, because this is where the wars come from. This is where the entire Palestinian conflict comes from. They're fighting over a piece of land because of a book. A book said so. And it's
right, and actually
so harmful.
Right, and to that point, that's where when people ask, why do you do what you do? It's because the question would be, well, do our beliefs inform our actions? Because if you believe that, hey, Jesus is going to come back, and, fuck the ozone, fuck all this, who really gives a crap?
And that's how they feel, yeah.
Yeah, then we have a problem, because our beliefs inform our actions. And if you believe that the world was going to end within your lifetime, as every generation going back to Jesus believed, even Jesus believed that the world was going to end within his lifetime. And that's clear when you read the earliest sources that we have. Mark, Matthew, Luke. Why are you smiling, Connie?
In the comments over here, some of our some people are noticing that the blind behind you, blinds behind
OCD.
you.
Oh,
they're OCD people.
my kids. Yeah.
That's funny.
I could bring in the little girl who did that.
Yeah.
She's.
I was like, yeah, I've noticed, and it's kind of been getting me too. But I have kids, so I understand. Mine look like that too. It's okay. So that's why I was laughing. It's just what's going on over here in the comments. We just continue.
Oh, well, where do we leave off? Well, the point is, regarding the end times, I actually gave a sermon on this topic a few weeks ago to the atheist community of Tulsa. We have these little things called Bible Babbles. We started it back in 2011, and basically it kind of began as me talking about the Bible, and it was very much a sermon-oriented thing, something with which I feel natural, having coming from a Bible college and talked in front of people, to go out there and just deliver a sermon. Obviously, the types of sermons I deliver are completely different, because now, as a non-believer, what I'm trying to do is equip non-believers like myself to just understand, because the Bible is confounding, it's confusing. Even I've read it many times, even I don't necessarily understand it all that well.
It's
But
kind of impossible. It's kind of meant that way. It's
right.
almost written that way, to be ambiguous.
Well, no, I just think it was written with their own theological agendas in mind. If you read the New Testament in particularly in a very horizontal way, you can kind of see, and by that I mean, like, I don't mean just don't read Matthew, you know.
Yeah, you mean to read like first verse.
Right,
Like
compare them horizontally, side by side, see the
Right.
differences, and you can point out at that point. You can see the themes. You can see John presenting his own Christology. John seems to have I guess you could say, the most developed Christology about Jesus. Matthew is very Torah-oriented, and yet the most anti-Semitic. Luke, I mean, if you just compare Mark, like, Jesus is constantly, God, he's angry.
Yeah.
He's angry at people.
Flipping
they can't figure out what he's
tables
saying. Yeah, and then and Luke, he's, with basically one exception, which even most scholars will say it's, hey, it's probably a fabrication. But here's Jesus. He's like, he can't be made mad. And so I think it's just basically you have these different Jesus communities, all of them with their own oral traditions and their own biases and their own prejudices and their fears, and they're very insulated. Us versus them. We're the correct ones. You're not. And they're all writing their oral traditions down. And then, years later, they're like, we've got to figure out what we're going to do. Comes the Nicene Creed, and they say, all the councils come together and they say, how are we going to make it canon about this? Because Marcion is basically saying Luke was the shit to Marcion, one of the early, not really church father, but he was basically one of the first people to develop a canon. And so they just took these books, these traditions, and they did their best, but they don't have the same linguistic tools that we have to determine who wrote what. There was no names appended to the titles of it. It wasn't Gospel of Matthew. It was just, it's hearsay. But these are clearly not eyewitness accounts. Even Luke goes as far as saying this when he's writing in the opening prologue to Luke, that these are accounts that he's getting from the best as he can. So I think that's why it's so muddy. It's because you have different people of different communities writing their own interpretations of something, and then later they get kind of slammed together. They get thrown together as best as they possibly can.
Yep. And it's just
We
copies
have
of copies and translations, mistranslations, and all that. It's just crazy.
We have a question from the audience here.
Sure.
How many times have the Ten Commandments been ratified, if ever, over the course of history?
Human history. Of all
Never.
human history.
Never.
Of human history.
I would say ratified, never. I would just simply say that, look, I don't believe that they were ever necessarily handed down. I mean, if you go back to First and Second Kings, if you're reading First and Second Kings, when they're talking about how all of this kind of came about, and you're talking about the northern and southern kingdoms, the Ten Commandments, which we don't know which set, the Ethical Decalogue, the Ritual Decalogue, which the Ethical Decalogue mostly mirrors Deuteronomy 5, so we would call that the Ethical Decalogue to the same degree. But all we know is that before they became a kingdom, they were just simply tribes. They were 12 distinctive geographical tribes, and then a 13th tribe, the tribe of the Levitical priests, which eventually seemed to have settled. There were, of course, in the southern kingdom, the ones who were writing these bad things against the northern kingdom whenever the king up there started establishing his own precedent. But before they were a kingdom, as far as we can tell, it seemed that the Ten Commandments, they would hop skip to each different tribe. It wasn't until Solomon's temple, the instructions for which were given in Exodus, right before the Exodus 20 Ten Commandments, that they actually found a home. Now, which set of Ten Commandments are they? You don't really quite get the answer, except that we know that in Exodus 34, that's the only set called the Ten Commandments. But it seems to be that the whole story about Moses breaking the first set could have possibly been the northern tribe, the northern kingdom, trying to say, you know what, that set that's in Solomon temples, they're not there. They're broken. These are the Ten Commandments. Or it could have been added by some later redactors, some Aaronite priest who is trying to explain away. Why are there two sets? You know, when you go back to, let's say, the New Testament, you see that you have different infancy narratives, you have different passion narratives, you know, all these different narratives. We have these traditions which say, during King Herod's reign and during Governor Quirinius, or however you pronounce his name, it's escaping me for some reason. But, you know, they combine these stories about the inn and the magi and the wise men, and they combine them. And that's kind of what was happening during the formulation of the Old Testament. So I'm trying to give an impression of what's really happening about this time. There probably was no one set of ratified laws. Mm-hmm. There was just the different oral traditions. They all had their beliefs, but as you can tell in the Exodus 34 version, they are basically specifically addressing the northern kingdom with the no molten gods. Because of course Aaron supposedly, Moses comes down because he's been up there for 40 days. He comes down and they're worshiping a golden calf. And you take those words and I think it's 1 Kings. I can't remember the exact verse, but takes the words of the king and places them in the words of the mouth. And they say, here is our God who we will worship. You see this interplay between the northern and southern kingdoms. I don't think there was ever one set of 10 Commandments, truly. I just believe that there was this oral tradition about the 10 Commandments, and these are these laws that seem to kind of make sense in that ancient Near East time period. Possibly, obviously, might have been influenced by the Code of Hammurabi, the Code of Ur-Nammu, that they just had simply their laws. And there's 613 laws in the Old Testament, of which there are countless, of course, in Exodus 34, Deuteronomy 5, Exodus 20. There was no one ratified 10 Commandments. There was no one set of 10 Commandments. They're just simply laws that each kingdom kind of created
through all
for
of it.
themselves.
Have there ever been changes in the terminology throughout all translations and versions?
It's always we really won't know.
As far as like the different biblical translations.
Well, as far as translations, there are different interpretations. Let me try to think of some.
Let me look.
Off the top of my head, they'll be worded differently. But
I opened it right up to Exodus 34. Is that like, ooh?
It must be God.
I know, right?
So, no, I don't. As far as translations, I think that they've been pretty good. You look at the Septuagint, you had 80 different people all taking the... Of course, you do have a few things, I would say, that in the Septuagint, which might possibly be mistranslations. I would say Isaiah 7:14 would be one of them. And that's, of course, where many Christians believe that, Emmanuel, a woman is bare or something, she is with a child, and his name will be Emmanuel. Before he comes to an age where he knows right from wrong and he begins eating milk and honey, this kingdom will falter, this and that. And they interpret that as meaning it's a prediction, a prophecy about Jesus, even though the context makes it quite clear that that's not what he's regarding something that's going to happen within about 3 to 4 years. The prophet Isaiah is, at least. But yeah, the word Betula is translated as virgin. So that's one where the Septuagint got wrong. The biggest question I would say would be, did these change? And from what we can tell, yes, they changed, because what we see, the documented hypothesis, it would take a lot to unpack it. It would be a whole hour show unto itself. But you have these doublets, and you notice that in these doublets you have certain terminology. Elohim is one God. Elohim derives from El, and we talked about before the show began, theophany, the name of the practice of taking God, your God's name, and putting it into the name of a proper name of somebody. Israel, Bethel, Daniel, Elijah. What we see is El seemed to have been a God that was favored. And even in Psalms 82, it talks about God being on the council, this great thing. I don't even remember what the hell the question was anyways, but we're getting a documented hypothesis. But you see that, these different doublets, like in the Elder source, what we're talking about, like how Shechem, the capital of Israel, came about. In J, it says that Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, took upon themselves and slaughtered everybody in there. They inhabited it. But yeah, the LOS source says that Jacob bought the land in kind of an honorable fashion. He went out there and bought a parcel of field. And so you have these two different accounts. And that's ultimately where we get these two different sets. And from that, how did the traditions evolve from the kingdom from 922 to 722 BCE to the time of the Babylonian exile, that 400-year period? We perhaps will never know. But what we can see is that clearly there were multiple sources. And scholars have done a pretty terrific job, because it's not just a matter of different terminology, Yahweh or Elohim.
Jehovah
Right. It's just there's certain stylistic differences. All these evidences seem to converge on the point that if you take away these doublets and you separate them, and you see that in one doublet creation account, it's referred to Yahweh, and one is referred to Elohim. But if you take those specific doublets out, and you take them out based upon the way scholars have done, you see that it flows through from front to end. If you just take the Yahwist account, for example, it flows like it's its one own narrative. And so I think that what these Old Testament, the people who developed the Torah, what they were doing is they were doing what many Christians today do with the infancy narrative, with the passion narrative, things that contradict what they believe to be true. So they didn't do it selectively, they did it maximally. How can we take all these writings we have and combine them? And that's why it gets so confusing. We won't know how many times it changed before that, though. All we have is what we have. But what we can tell is that it most certainly was not something handed down by God. It was something written with biases, human biases in mind.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
There's my daughter.
Now, to close up, let's talk about how you came into becoming an atheist. How you came to the conclusion of atheism. Where'd you start off? What kind of journey did you undergo to get there?
I was raised in a Christian household. My mother was Catholic, and in fact, I still have her. I still have a cross hanging up in my house that she had.
Nice.
But to me, it means something to me.
Of course. Yeah.
My mother did pass away when I was younger, and that is a story I do not like telling, only because when we're having these kind of conversations, it becomes that's why you're an atheist, right? Mm-hmm. Because your mother passed away, you know.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I get the same because of the way my mom passed away also. So.
We'll have both.
Yeah, it's horrible when you're trying to point out that this is very much an intellectual journey for me. I'm still seeking the truth, and I still read the Bible every single day, only because I'm trying to figure out. I find it fascinating. It's humanity at its worst and its best, but it's humanity when you read the Bible. I see people trying to figure out the world. But I still have these things. They're cherishable to me. My mom was a Catholic, though. My aunt was a Protestant, and she would basically take me to church, and it was a tongue-speaking, blah, 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 that kind of church, which felt weird. But I began to believe in a God. I was a pretty devout Christian whenever I was in middle school and high school. In fact, I met an atheist from my graduating class. We met at one of the Atheist Community Tulsa events. He was like, "Oh my gosh, you're an atheist?" And I was like, "Yeah, you're an atheist." He was like, "Whenever you were in high school, you were the biggest Bible thumper I knew." And I guess I didn't really realize. And when I look back now, I guess, yeah, I was. I was the kid in art class who was constantly drawing Jesus, did different depictions of Jesus.
Jeez.
So when I graduated high school, it seemed kind of natural for me to just go to a Bible college. So I went to Hillsdale Free Will Baptist College, and I played baseball there, but that's a different story. So what I wanted to do was, I think every Christian kind of finds himself in this position. I think that maybe they see that you believe the stuff and you really want to reach out. You want to minister. You want to witness.
Yeah. But
I took this different approach, because what I realized was, 1 Peter 3:15, which is a pseudepigrapha. We mentioned that word earlier. I think pseudepigrapha just means it's forged. It's not written by the person it says. And we gathered this because in the book of Acts it says Peter and many of the disciples were agrammatos, the Greek word for unlettered. They were unlearned. They were ill-educated. Right. And yet 1 Peter is written highly, highly classical Greek, a very beautiful language. And then I think it's 1 Peter 5. I can't remember, but it talks about how I'm writing you from the church of Babylon. And, of course, the Babylonians, we see, were the first to destroy the temple in the Old Testament, as described in the book of Jeremiah. So when the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD, they began referring to Rome as Babylon and the Romans as Babylonians. And so when he's saying, I'm writing you from the Church of Babylon, it's a reference to Rome, which, of course, the temple was destroyed in 70 BC. And according to church tradition, Peter died in 65 BC. So that's an anachronism. So anyways, in 1 Peter 3:15, it says, be ready to give an answer to every man that asks you a question about the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. And what I figured was that in order for me to be prepared to give an answer, what I need to do, I need to ask the same kind of questions that atheists would ask of me. Because if you're going to be going to war, it behooves you to understand your weaknesses and the strengths of your opponents. And not that I viewed atheists as being opponents necessarily, but I needed to be prepared. So I began reading atheist literature. I began going to the Yahoo chat forums, because back then it was very difficult to find an open atheist that at least would speak to me. So I'd go to the Yahoo chat forums where people, could hide behind, the innocuous screen and just type from there. And I met a lot of these asshole atheists. Just, these assholes were like, well, if God could lift a rock so big, I wasn't involved in that. What I wanted was the intellectual conversation with an atheist, and I found a number of them. One of them stands out. Her name is Paula. And we engaged for a very long time, over a course of about 2 to 3 years. While I'm in college, I'm learning all this stuff. I'm learning different things about Christianity, but also the things that they're not telling me. Having read the Bible, none of it made sense, but all of a sudden, here's these people explaining these different things, and they're asking me questions for which I was ill-prepared. So I thought, I have to think like an atheist. I have to, show me your sources, because I came into this thinking, God, when the Holy Spirit comes, it will lead you into all truth, as it says in the Gospel of John. So I'm thinking, the Holy Spirit's in me. Send me. Give me your best, because you cannot crush me. Send me your links. Talk to me. Give me Bible verses. Show me where I'm wrong. And I will come out the victor, and I will win you to Christ. And you know what happened? The exact opposite.
They brought you.
All of a sudden. Exactly.
They brought you to reality.
It was this, and there was no one moment. That's the thing, when did you realize, I guess, there was no, we talked beforehand about the realization that I was an atheist. I don't even think I realized, like, hey, I'm an atheist. But I remember I was the lead guitarist in my praise and worship band. There I am playing, and it just hit me that I'm doing this for the music, because what's really, truly moving me is the music. Mm-hmm. And I remember sitting there when the service was done, because we'd had service in this is a Bible college. And I remember saying my last prayer, but it was the one thing that was, if I'm wrong about everything I think I know, and I'm still learning, then God knows me. He knows my heart. He knows that I can't choose to believe. The philosophy of direct doxastic voluntarism, the idea that you can choose your beliefs, it's just completely bogus. It's nil. So here I am. If God exists as I believed him, he knows that I don't believe. So the only person I'm fooling is myself. So that was at that moment when I realized, at the very least, I didn't believe in the Christian God. And it was fearful, because I actually prayed. I said, God, please forgive me if I'm wrong, but I can't choose to believe you. So that was 2002. Here we are, 2015, 13 years later. I kind of kept quiet for it, but I never stopped reading. I came and found the atheist community of Tulsa. Back then it was just Tulsa Atheists. Somehow got my damn mug put up on a billboard, and we started this convention, in Oklahoma, and here I am. And then
So
that's kind of how I got
you
to
became
be
American Atheist, then? Is through the
Yeah,
conventions?
it was this thing where the former predecessor, Ron Pitzer, great guy, he came to the first convention, and there was like 315 or 318 people or something there, of which he was one. And he tried talking to me. This was 2011. He kept trying to talk me into taking over his position. He thought I would be good for it. I was like, no. I'm not ready for that. I'm just trying to have fun. I'm just trying to be an influence, in some way. But I didn't really want to do anything like this. But he continued pestering me, and then I finally said, you know what, I'll do it on a few conditions, that I get to do it my way. And so they agreed. And so that's when I started saying, all right, my first act of business is going to be to get that damn monument removed. Nice. And so it took a lot of pushing. It took a lot of, I would continually contact David Silverman of American Atheists, the president. I'd say, we got to get this done. Contact the legal director, we got to get this done. And they're like, yeah, we're on it. And then finally they contacted me and they said, all right, are you ready to do this? And this was October of 2012, maybe 2013, I can't remember. And they said, yeah, 2013. And I was just, doing it for a few months, and they said, are you ready to do this? You've been pressured. I said, sure, I want to do this. So they said, all right, we're moving forward.
Nice.
And then we moved forward on it.
That's
Awesome. All right, yeah. So I think that's a good place to close up. We'll definitely have
Refreshing.
William on some other time.
We'll have
And
plenty more atheist things to do as an organization, definitely.
yeah. So thank you for watching That Atheist Show. Go like us on Facebook.
And
Subscribe to
please,
the channel if you haven't already.
If you guys see church and state separation violations happening in your local area, in your local news, in your news feed, anything like that, send it to us. Go to our Facebook page, link it to us, show us what you got. If it's personal, link it to us. Show us what's going on.
If
We
you
will
want to
contact
remain
FRF and more.
anonymous, we can keep you anonymous.
Yes.
But
Message us, do
we
something.
want to expose and talk about all of the issues that are happening that aren't getting the media attention that they deserve.
Right.
So
And-
send over everything over to us, because we got a
And by all
lot
means,
of
send it to
attention.
me as well.
We got a
What
lot of
happened?
attention going for the Hawkins, Texas thing. So
Yeah, send it to me as well, because if it's happening in Oklahoma, I want to know. That's WPOIRE@atheist.org. Or you can just go to atheist.org, go to state directors, find my name, send me an email. If something's happening in your school, a public school, any sort of violation, Connie knows I travel all the way down to Duncan, Oklahoma. It's a 3-hour drive for me. I'm willing to travel. We want to make sure that everybody's treated equally. So notify me right after you notify them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no,
Connie
we're
and if
Preston.
it's happening in Oklahoma, I will definitely pass it along to him if you pass it on to us.
And
But
our
anywhere
email
in the
is-
country,
our
let us
email
know.
is suggestions@thatatheistshow.com, or you have Connie at thatatheistshow.com and Preston at thatatheistshow.com. So email us everything you have. Definitely.
Yep. Thank you for supporting us. You guys have been awesome so far. This has taken off a lot better than we ever expected.
Yeah.
So thanks, guys. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to doing bigger and better things in the future. Y'all have a good night. See you next week.
See you next
Thank you.
week. Thank you, William.